Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, December 4th, 2024. Coming on the end of the year, coming up towards a transition in Washington, and coming off of a very enjoyable chairwoman's dinner last night for the Federal Communications Bar Association. I love the event. I was there. I had a chance to chat with people, including former Chairman Dick Wiley, former Chairman Ajit Pai, and current NTIA head Alan Davidson. Where can you run into everyone in the same room like that? That's Washington for you, okay? Now we are in Washington. Actually, I'm in Great Falls, Virginia today, but we are based in Washington, and we are a news and events community focused on better broadband, better lives. My name is Drew Clark. I'm CEO and publisher, and our news and events community is all about better broadband, better lives, how we get higher capacity internet, and what we do with that capacity when we get it. And we've been doing this series, this Broadband Breakfast Live Online, every Wednesday since the pandemic on we actually started on Friday, but Friday the 13th. I mean, of course, that's the day the pandemic hit in March, nearly 5 years ago. And we've been doing this weekly event. We're really grateful to the sponsors of Broadband Breakfast that enable us to do this weekly event, which includes, that is to say, our sponsors include Utopia Fiber, Comcast, Ookla, Wesco, Coos Systems, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's Community Broadband Networks Initiative, the California Emerging Technology Fund, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, CostQuest, ACA Connects, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Without the support of our sponsors, we couldn't do this program, which is just one of many things that we do at Broadband Breakfast. The other is the news reporting that you receive in your inbox and on Broadband Breakfast every day. And we do special events. In fact, we have a very special event coming up next Thursday, 8 days from now. It is Broadband in the Trump administration. We just announced this morning we have a special keynote speaker for that, Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. We're very excited to welcome her to talk about broadband in the Trump administration and the interface that the administration will have with Congress. We're going to be talking about issues including finishing the job on BEAD, return to Spectrum Authority, question mark, reforming the Universal Service Fund, question mark, and with the Chevron deference standard dead, will courts check the next administration? Those are some of the topics we'll be considering. I've mentioned Senator Blackburn's keynote. Also pleased to announce a fireside chat that I'll be conducting with Hilda Legg, the former head of the Rural Utility Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the George W. Bush administration. And we're going to be talking again, all things broadband in the next administration. Don't miss it. We'll be posting an opportunity to view the live stream, to register to view the live stream, probably tomorrow or Friday. But the opportunity is now to sign up to attend the event in person at Clydes of Gallery Place. Well, with that, I want to kind of move to our topic at hand. Today, we're going to be talking about broadband permitting. I mean, what a topic, right? I mean, no, seriously, it is quite a topic. Like that and pole attachments, right? Those are the two that like just get the wonk juices flowing. We're going to be talking today specifically about the issue of broadband and the permitting process for broadband when it comes to federal lands. Okay, and this is among the very thorny issues in implementing BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, as well as many other programs too. In fact, and we were just chatting with our panelists ahead of time, I mean, this is an issue that comes up in every infrastructure program, both for telecom and for energy. It has come up with, pipelines, and it's come up with, electric transmission plants, and it's come up when the original Recovery Act of 2009 came forward. I remember lots and lots of discussions about the complications of getting permitting on federal lands, the time-consuming concerns, and how these can create delays for BEAD. I don't know if this in particular has created delays, but it's certainly an issue worth discussing and considering. And for our panel today, we are very excited. Let me open up our view to all of our panelists here. We are very excited to welcome Stephen Keegan, Senior Counsel for Government and Legal Affairs for WIA, which is the Wireless Infrastructure Association, and Ryan Kudera, Manager of Client Services for Finley Engineering. Let me just say a word or two more about each of our panelists. Stephen, in his role as Senior Counsel at WIA, analyzes legal and policy issues affecting the wireless industry before state and federal policymakers. And he's also led federal advocacy before agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management, the Federal Communications Commission, the National Telecommunications Information Administration. I don't know what NPS stands for, but you'll enlighten me, I'm sure, Steve.
National Park Service.
National Park Service. Okay, of course, right? One of those very, very favorable or very positive three-letter agencies, right? And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Why do I know Fish and Wildlife Service, but I don't know National Park Service? Anyway, maybe blame Illinois. I worked in Illinois for several years. Stephen, we're so excited to have you to get WIA's perspective. In just a moment, we'll turn to you to give us some thoughts. But I also wanted to introduce Ryan a bit more. He joined Finley Engineering in 2022 as a senior consultant and as now the manager of client services. He has also worked as the broadband director for the state of Wyoming. And he's served many roles in telecom, broadband, and energy sectors during 25 years in field operations, instruction, economic development, primarily focused in the Rocky Mountain West. Thanks for getting up early to be part of our program here today. So let's turn it over to you, Stephen, to give us your lay of the land on this question, both as we've looked backwards into the BEAD program in the Biden administration and maybe issues that we may be wanting to consider as we go into the Trump administration next year. So over to you, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Drew. And thank you to everyone for joining today. My name is Stephen Keegan. I am the Senior Counsel, as Drew mentioned, at the Wireless Infrastructure Association here in DC. We are the trade association representing the organizations that make the networks work. The physical layer, including tower owners, professional service providers, along with the nationwide carriers, and a handful of communication equipment vendors as well. And so I think you're right, Drew. This is a super important issue for our members. It touches on every aspect of broadband deployment. And I think it's well known that this can be a thorny issue.
I just lost sound. Sorry.
Oh.
Now it's back. I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. It's an important issue. It touches on all broadband deployment. We see this as particularly a key issue in the BEAD context because those federal lands really abut to the rural Americans. And so crossing those areas will be very important for achieving the universal service goals of BEAD and, the federal government generally. So I think it's not saying anything, and no one knows that federal land permitting can be a particularly thorny issue. They are, to their credit, working with fewer resources, covering broader jurisdictions. And so, there's a lot of work being done to try to coordinate that process, make it more streamlined. I think, to NTIA's credit specifically, they have been doing a lot of work on making sure that the permitting work is getting done ahead of the actual funding being released for BEAD. We've seen some great improvements from that team. Particularly, they entered into a new national programmatic agreement with ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, to streamline Section 106 reviews. That was actually notable for being applicable to all federally funded programs. So that was a big expansion where it used to just be projects on federal lands. Now there's actually a Section 106 historic review streamlining available for all federal projects. And I think also on the Hill, we saw this year or last year, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which directed the Council on Environmental Quality to review its NEPA guidance. And so that has been playing out. The CEQ has an ongoing proceeding that is looking to streamline the process. Also in the FRA, they adopted new rules that allowed different agencies to adopt existing categorical exclusions. And, you're right, this gets into the wonkiness pretty quickly, but CADXs are a huge boon for trying to get projects done, especially when the impact won't be is at least predictable. It won't be too impactful on the environment. And so now agencies are able to adopt the existing categorical exclusions. We've seen, I believe it was Forest Service adopted Bureau of Land Management within the last few months. And so, streamlining on that front has been huge. There's still more work to be done, though. And so we are hopeful that, the new administration will take this on. I think worth noting in Trump 1.0, we saw the Ray Bonds Act, which included the Mobile Now Act, and that had some pretty large streamlining efforts on federal lands, along with the Farm Bill. Farm Bill is also up for reauthorization, so there may be some work being done on that front in the 119th Congress. And so, I think we're pretty hopeful that the new administration will take this on. Chairman Carr at the FCC has been a huge champion on this front, so he's very interested, we think, in continuing this good work. It will take Congress, it will take NTIA, it'll take the FCC all working together, but we're hopeful that we can see some significant improvements coming down the pike.
Let me just ask one follow-up question before we turn it over to Ryan. You mentioned the words CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality. Could you just speak to this issue? Why does environmental quality come up when we're talking broadband? Could you just sort of put that in context for us a little bit, Stephen?
Yeah, happy to. And I think we can touch on this a little bit more too, because there's some ongoing litigation in this front, which is pretty interesting. But the Council on Environmental Quality is a White House advisory council. They set the policy. NEPA itself is actually a pretty straightforward language in the Environmental Protection Act. It just says that the federal government will take into account environmental effects of major federal actions. The CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, actually sets the broader agenda about what is major federal action, what the impacts are, how the process works. And so if folks are in this world, they know, your project can kind of fall into three broad categories, ranging from a categorical exclusion, which would be the lowest NEPA review. Next up would be an environmental assessment. And then the most kind of impactful or burdenful is the environmental impact statement. And so CEQ sets the rules of the road for each agency to set up how they're going to handle that environmental review.
Thank you. We'll come back to that, I promise. All right, let's turn it over to you, Ryan. Tell us a little bit about your on-the-ground experience of this topic.
Good morning. Hey, a lot of my experience, like I said, it's been 25 years in the Rocky Mountain West, Wyoming specifically. And what's really been interesting in the past is the option of private versus public right-of-way, which specifically runs right into many 3 and 4 named agencies. And historically, the operators out west have actually opted to go to the federal routes more so than private routes, just for the ease of access and ease of building, which is kind of a oxymoron for what we're talking about at times, of the fact that federal permitting is so difficult, and it has grown to that at a certain point. What also has kind of happened over the years is the allowance of each agency to kind of adopt its own rules, not even only on a national level, but local. We've run into a lot of that one particular office doesn't necessarily do the same as the same agency office elsewhere. So that adds just another layer to navigate through. It's actually interesting bringing up the ACHP and the streamlining for BEAD. There was an instance when I was at the governor's office that we did get stuck. We had an agency or a operator that had an application for a permit out there for 5 years that was held up for a historic review. And thankfully, we were able to get that resolved for them, and they were able to complete the issues. But just to say, it's definitely affecting the situations, and not only today in the short windows of BEAD, but definitely even in the past. We've had projects we've gotten started, got several $100,000 dollars in the ground and be stopped because of a change of mindset at an agency. So there's a lot of nuances even after approval that people get that can get caught up into. It's rare, but it has happened, and usually it's resolvable, and it's easily resolvable. It's just how someone might have understood a particular permit or a particular issue. So we've put in mine has all been on the ground. So it's been lengths and miles of fiber through Forest Service lands, through BLM, basically any agency you can come up with. We've put fiber through it at some point. So while I'm looking forward to some of the issues with BEAD and some of the addressing, I'd say the past iterations, the past administration actually kind of, while some aspects were helpful on the federal permitting, again, it kind of led to more individualistic interpretations out in the field. And so that really created some problems and some bottlenecks and some issues, even from just a handful of agencies in the same state. So I'm hoping that some of that streamlining helps. And then again, some of the streamlining they're starting to push through, bringing the Park Service and the Forest Service specifically to some of the BLM rules. That will help out here, because then when you go to a permit, you go to apply, you go to actually execute the permit and move things forward. You know what rules you're playing by. You're not playing by 15 different sets of rules for 3 different permits. You're playing by 2 or 3, hopefully, maybe even down to 1.
So let's dive into a couple of questions, and I put this in the chat, and we'll post on the website as well. An article in March about I'm just sending it again to everyone. An article in March about the interplay of the many agencies. There's the National Historic Preservation Act, okay, and then there's the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and they, for some reason, historic preservation has an impact. Could either of you sort of elucidate that? Why historic preservation fits into this? Like, we got history, historic preservation, and we got environment, okay? And these are both impacting broadband. And for the average viewer who cares about broadband, and they're going, like, why does this impact this? Why are historic preservation, why are environmental, why do they even have a say, if you will, on deploying broadband projects? So both that general question, but then the specifics of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Stephen, you want to go first on that point?
Yeah, happy to. Our experience isn't as direct with the historic folks, but Section 106 also incorporates all tribal reviews. Recently, I had the opportunity to head out to Arizona for NTIA and BLM. We're hosting a training on federal lands, and really was pretty educational, at a minimum, but really showing how much different components these projects can impact. At the end of the day, it is infrastructure. There's going to be ground disruptions if you're laying fiber, if you're digging a post hole, if you're putting up a tower. Maybe especially on the wireless side for our members, you may want to co-locate that antenna on an existing structure. Could be a historic structure, so they will work with the communities to make sure that antenna is minimally disruptive. But again, it is just following, I think, the rules of the road, making sure we're respecting what has come before, making sure that we're partners, our members are partners with the community. We want to make sure that folks are connected, but also that you're not, trampling over things that are important. And that can range from, burial sites, as we learned on tribal lands, and culturally sensitive locations, to old churches that are right in the center of town that make for great places to co-locate an antenna that you can stealth and put under that steeple, and bring more connectivity to that community. So historic reviews definitely play an important role within the broader ecosystem. And the ACHP is kind of, I think of them as the corollary to the CEQ on the historic side, to what CEQ is on the environmental.
Mm-hmm. And specifically the changes in March on this topic that I referenced, could you just speak to what was done and how big a deal was it? Again, Stephen first, then we'll get to you, Ryan.
Sure. And so on this front, and I had talked a little bit about the ACHP change. I believe the article you sent around was more on the tribal focus, but the changes that NTIA and ACHP entered into for broadband projects generally, I think were really, common sense best practices. All these regulations can quickly spiral out, become this protracted review period. And I don't think anyone, besides the folks who are being disruptive, really want that. And disruptive in the not in the Silicon Valley sense, but in the impediment to broadband. And so I think they sat down and kind of looked at the list of requirements that are out there and said, okay, what do we need? What is impactful? What makes moves the needle in a really meaningful way? And so the foundational document of that agreement is actually the National Programmatic Comment, which ACHP had developed with the FCC. I believe back in 2016, maybe 2014, but actually focused on small cells. And there was a recognition there that as the kind of networks were being densified, you were using these smaller equipment that would have less of an impact on the environment. And so the rules had to become more proportional to what the deployment actually looked like. There's obviously much more ground disruption when you're putting up a new 200-foot tower versus when you were putting 4 antennas and an equipment cabinet on that existing structure. So under Chairman Pai, they worked to streamline that. And so I think they built on that to make sure it was more encompassing to recognize the broader wireless or rather broadband infrastructure ecosystem that includes fiber, that includes, antennas for fixed wireless, for small cells, for densification. Potentially data centers are continuing to become a point of discussion around this as well. I think that's a little bit more on the horizon. But I think ultimately it's all about proportionality and making sure the rules are, doing what they're meant to do and not creating new obstacles to wireless.
Right. No, thank you. Wireless and broadband, of course.
And broadband.
But I appreciate, again, we're trying to dig through a complicated area and literally dig through. And I wonder again what we can do to sort of sum up what the problem has been and what has been done about that. Ryan, let me give you a chance to weigh in on this perspective again. Specifically on environmental and historic preservation rules, but also about the role that the NTIA has tried to play and has played in this topic.
Oh yeah. As far as like the environmental role and the historic preservation, the environmental role, definitely on the public lands has always been such a thing. And out here, what's really impactful, just to throw another facet in there, is wildlife as well. I mean, that's both preservation and what we're thinking there. Anyway, on the historic preservation side, there's so many things, and I guess I'm falling into this category on a personal level, is what we might think of as historic preservation may not be considered something by someone else. My case in point is the Lincoln Highway. It's Highway 30 out here. It's south of I-80. It's been buried under sagebrush in the BLM for decades. I mean, I don't think anybody's gone down Highway 30. There's some YouTubers that found some of the old concrete posts, which I find intriguing. But still, it's there. The nice thing is it's flat. And if anybody had a sense to find it, it might be a good plow place, just saying. But it does go across BLM, it does go across private, and it's there. But I would really hesitate to stick a plow in the road base of old Lincoln Highway. You're gonna have a problem on your hands, because that would be considered historic preservation. So that's just a kind of a visual way to look at some of that stuff, or imagine our friends up in Montana plowing through a Lewis and Clark campsite. It would not go over well. Or likewise our friends in Missouri with some issues down there. But those are the things that don't always necessarily come to front of mind when we talk historic preservation. That's something that I don't know what it looks like, but there are people out there that do. And while it is important for yesterday, tomorrow is just as important as well. And I think that's the key right now, is being able to address both of that, of, keeping in mind what we were, while we're building as a country to what we can be. And so, bringing the mindset across the board, across the agencies, across the industry, and not just ours. It's also, like, so I've used, as you've mentioned, electric, natural gas, and all this stuff that actually transverses across public land to get across the nation and the world. Bringing that back to a point that we can keep and save all of our historic sites, as well as be able to move for tomorrow.
Right. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
No, you're good. You're good.
Well, and I sent another article again to our Zoom listeners. We'll post it on the site for everyone to reference, discussing again the specific linking of permitting reform for energy as well as telecommunications and broadband projects, right? And this was at our event a year and a half ago, called the Made in America Summit, on the reforms that were involving federal agencies involved with land management. And so, again, we want to have a good discussion, an open discussion. We're starting to get some questions, and we're going to go ahead and start to take those questions. I think, again, maybe one additional thing I've got that don't need to answer right now, but like, is there a different process in place for dealing with permitting of energy related projects? Because we can certainly expect this will be an issue in the Trump administration. I mean, if there's one kind of broadband or broadband adjacent topic that has come out of the Trump campaign during the campaign, Trump administration during the campaign, it is, stop impeding pipeline, stop impeding the ability to, and I hear this a lot when I talk with legislators from the West, right, Ryan? So this is something that kind of seems to come naturally to folks in Wyoming and Montana and elsewhere, Utah. When I talk about them, they talk about this. So maybe let me get you one more chance, Ryan, to weigh in on this kind of edge of it before we start to go to the questions.
Oh, very good. I do wanted to shout out to the NTIA, as you mentioned, the work that they've done. I know the folks over there, not as well as I used to by any means, but they have done a lot of work on this specific topic, working with the agencies, the FCC, Congress, Pew, the whole list, to try and get things done. So just a shout out to them and everything they've done. Specifically to energy, one thing that a lot of people don't reference what we do in the fiber placement world and the energy is, technically, if you think about it, our conduit, we're building a pipeline. When we started all of this, I started all of this, I was north of Kansas City, and that was half my crew was Oklahoma pipeliners. And that's what we do. We build a pipeline. The only difference is we don't put petroleum in. From the energy sector, we've seen out west, we've seen a significant ease in permitting for renewable energy. Hasn't been easy for them. I'm not saying that, but there has been some ease for them in different areas and some very heavy support in those to try and get those projects done. I'm really looking forward to this new administration, as is most of the Rocky Mountain region, for the same treatment on potential carbon-based pipelines and everything else associated with that moving forward, that they might again see similar treatment to what we've seen sometimes in the renewable world at this point.
All right. And if I can jump in on that, from the federal perspective, we saw this Congress, outgoing Senator Manchin and Senator Barrasso, who will likely be the new majority whip in the next Congress, introduce a pretty substantial energy permitting reform bill. And you can see it really does focus on NEPA, getting government out of the way. So we were very heartened to see that bipartisan go forward. We're hopeful that it may even pass before the end of the year. I don't think anything is certain at this point, particularly with everything else that's moving around it. But that did get out of the Senate Commerce Committee earlier this year. On the House side, HR 3557 is something, and the American Broadband Deployment Act has been something that WIA has been heavily engaged on. And this would do a lot of the same things, kind of tying into your, future of broadband under the Trump administration. But with the death of Loper Bright, getting Congress to speak clearly on this is more important than ever. because a lot of the streamlining, as we've been saying, has been coming from the agencies for decades. And Loper Bright and the death of Chevron is great if you don't like a rule. It's not so great if you do like a rule, because it's just as easily challenged under that kind of framework. So we've been really pushing for the American Broadband Deployment Act. We're expecting it to be reintroduced next Congress. That passed out of Energy and Commerce back in 2023. Was on party lines, but now with Republican trifecta, its odds do seem a bit better. But this is something that Representative Buddy Carter, who's the sponsor, and Bob Latta, and all the Energy and Commerce Republicans care very deeply about. And so we're really hopeful to see it continued on into the 119th.
This is HR 3557, American Broadband Deployment Act, that you've just referenced. If it does have support of Republicans, who of course still have control of the House, are you saying it couldn't or wouldn't happen this year in the lame duck because time, or because the Senate's not going to pass it? Why couldn't it go through if Republicans are supportive?
Yeah, we've been really hopeful that at least we would get a floor vote before the end of this year. It did pass out of committee on party lines. It includes a lot of the FCC reforms from the Trump administration, including shot clocks and deemed granted, which have been really great tools in the toolkit. Unfortunately, some of the members of the Democratic caucus find that that's too infringing on state and local. And so that component of it, I think, makes it a little bit more difficult in a divided Congress. But there is a big piece of that deals with NEPA, NIPA. And so we would hope to see, there's even discussions about maybe getting broadband exempt from the definition of a major federal action. So that would, instead of even having to do the CADXs, you get to just kind of go forward with your project, because it is recognizing that this infrastructure is so important. And, it really is not as necessarily impactful to the environment and everything. It's not as disruptive. So making sure the rules are right sized to kind of the impact of the deployment is something that we think could be palatable.
Yeah, I mean, this is the irony, right? I mean, the energy stuff gets all the attention, right? And we're either talking about massive lines for electricity and or gasoline versus a little conduit for fiber, right? I mean, so the environmental impact cannot be as great as those other two things just referenced. Let's dive into questions. We're starting to get some. Please put them in the Q&A field. This one is from Ryan Lindsay, and he says, we have a member that recently mentioned needing an environmental review through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in Arizona. I was wondering what the difference would be there compared to an environmental review via the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in New Mexico. Ryan, sounds like right up your alley. Talk about this, please.
Find all my buttons here. Yeah, honestly, the environmental review is going to be probably a little more detailed with the Fish and Wildlife Service than it would be the NTIA. It just really pay a lot of attention to what they're actually asking for as far as the environmental review, and then follow their guidelines. A lot of the biggest thing is with the permitting, especially where you're going back and forth with an agency. It's kind of like going back and forth to your folks on what you did on Friday night. Keep it to the facts, just the facts, and give them enough information that it satisfies what you need, and it leads to less getting less caught up in the extraneous information, and really just pay attention to what they're asking for. Make sure your contractor, whoever that may be, that's working on the environmental side of it, does the same and treats each one kind of as a separate entity, while the information could be the same across. As far as the specifics, generalize each one for each specific individual entity, I guess what I'm trying to say.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts on kind of state level reviews? I hadn't really thought about, do I have a choice between a state review or a federal review, or doesn't everything need to go through both?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'm not entirely sure. I think there is definitely a hand-in-hand component with this. And it's a question of, does the project cross a federal highway? Obviously, if you're getting into the specific jurisdictions of a park or BLM land, obviously you have to deal with the folks there. But I do think there's at least an effort to kind of make these into regions that are more consistent internally. and I think we hear from members consistently that it is not a consistent process. If you're, out west dealing with BLM versus, just to use an example, not necessarily to call out an agency, but out west region versus the central, US region versus the Eastern coast, you can just get different responses. And like I said, they are dedicated professionals who are dealing with huge tracts of land, getting permits, from across the board. So I sympathize that it's not a one size fits all. To go back to some of the reforms that NTIA has done, which I think could be helpful in this context, they've actually worked to consolidate a map. It's available, I believe, on the Broadband USA website, but shows actually where the different federal land management jurisdictions are, where existing obligations are for other projects, so that you can kind of coordinate Dig Once policies. So I think, and like Ryan said, they've been really trying to be data driven, trying to make this process more consistent. I think they've made some really great strides in it. So we're hopeful that that will continue on into the upcoming administration as well.
We have a good question building on this from Jessica Hatch. We have had discussion on this issue with the local county level and asked our local government to review their permitting to ensure that things do not stop due to local permitting. Well, now we've got all three layers of government, federal, state, and local. Could both of you speak to the local component, and is that the least onerous, the most onerous? How does that fit into the topic we're talking about, of course, which is federal lands and the federal role?
I can kind of roll through that. First, the local level can be both as far as issues as far as permitting. It could be very simple as paying your fee and getting the permit. It could be as problematic or more problematic than some of the federal issues, because it goes through so many different layers. The largest thing that I can say on the local level, and probably the most success I've had in my career, is kind of doing what sounds like you've started to do already, Jessica, is go out and talk to them. Say, hey, well, this is what we're planning on doing. Maybe even do a show and tell of what you're trying to do. Explain to them how it works, and assure them that, hey, you've got a point of contact. If anything goes wrong during the process, we'll take care of it. The other point to that is I've actually recommended to clients and folks in the West, specifically because we have a lot of one-person local permitting shops, offer assistance. Not specifically for your permit, but offer them. Go to your competitors, go to other people in the industry and say, hey, we want to help you, help us make sure that you get what you need, and we'll kind of guide you through this stuff that you may not understand as best we can. We can't, of course, legal advice and all that, but offer the assistance ahead of time with a as many times happens on the Hill, a bipartisan effort on a local level to help the permitting process through, and you'll actually be surprised at the response.
Do you have thoughts on the local piece of it? And Jessica supplemented her question with an additional one, which is safety on right-of-way maintenance. So could you speak to the local versus state versus federal rules on permitting for an infrastructure project, Stephen?
Again, not something that I've had too much experience with directly. We mostly get these, relayed to our members, but I think Ryan was right on with communication is really key. These folks are trying to get the job done. I think there's a broad consensus that, this is critical infrastructure that needs to get to these communities, particularly when you're dealing with federal lands. It's often rural areas that are underserved. And so being able to open those lines of communication, making sure that you clearly stating kind of what the objective is and how you're going about it, usually does come to good results, and there's usually a way to work with the jurisdiction to get the projects dealt with.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's other questions lurking here, but let's go to some others we've got here, and we still have a good 20 minutes, folks, for questions. I see more are coming in here, and Donald Longknife asks a great one that I wish we had thought through a little more to get this perspective. David asks, how does this affect tribal lands here in Montana, where we all have local carrier monopolies? I think Donald is saying the local carriers monopolize the different tribes. So I want to kind of ask both parts of this question, if you will. One is, what is your view, each of your views on the tribal role in permitting that involves tribal lands? That's one part of the question. And the other question is, how can those who want to get more competition in areas, not necessarily tribal areas, but areas nearby tribal go through areas that may impact tribes. How are they impacted by this permitting process? I hope that was a clear question. Do either of you want to tackle that question, Stephen or Ryan?
Yeah, I can try that one. So typically on a tribal, I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with both tribes here in Wyoming, and like most tribes and how that all worked out, they're not the best of friends, yet they're neighbors, so they have to figure it out. And for a long time, they literally would set in their different areas, and that's where things landed. Just recently, I think I heard it was last year or 2022, I can't remember, the tribes came to an agreement specifically on broadband. As Drew has mentioned, the understanding of how critical this is to get this infrastructure in place. These tribes came together and made an agreement saying, hey, we're going to work together to make sure that we can build out. Now they have their own fiber optic network and stuff, so that really is kind of aimed at that. But one avenue of that is it lands the opportunity and really helps to streamline if another provider wants to come in, or if somebody's looking to get through a tribal lands, then that helps streamline that for here. Specifically in Montana and the local carrier monopolization, that's where it goes back to boots on the ground, goes back to kind of how my career has been. Get together, in the tribe, get together with the tribes, figure out, okay, how can we attract others to come in here so we're not monopolized? Most places in the West, there's not a lot of highways out here. So because of that, there's usually fiber running right through places that goes internationally, and it doesn't take a lot to tap into that. What's the problem is actually getting the local right of way to get into the other areas to where they can actually connect to fiber to the home. So, kind of make a grassroots effort, if you will, at your local tribes, and that can lead to great and wonderful things as far as competition and access and the like. We all know that the tribes really support casinos and the like. I can assure you that they're actually well connected, and that's a great stop off point within the tribal land to build out from. So there's different opportunities. Just takes different viewpoints to look at how to move forward.
Stephen, do you want to tackle this one too, or shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, nothing really to add on to that.
All right. We have a question here from Randy Leaning, and it may be a question for follow-up, but he asks if someone could list the applicable acts or the relevant data sets. And I'm just wondering, I think it's a useful question for everyone's benefit. What are the data sets, literally the GIS data sets that, WIA and your members or Finley Engineering or other entities that are out there, or state broadband offices? What are the kind of sets of geographic information systems data that you need to be able to successfully navigate the federal permitting process? Stephen first.
Yeah, and Ryan, I'm really interested to hear what you guys are using out there on the ground, because, like I said, a lot of my experience is more on the theoretical and policy side. But as I mentioned, NTIA has worked to get that national broadband availability map off the ground. I think that was a huge undertaking. It seems to be pretty effective. At least when I look at it, I think it's cool. I'm like, oh, look, this is, a BLM land. This is Forest Service. It shows you where you need to be. The part of it was IIJA, but the FCC has done a lot of work on improving their broadband data availability maps, or the broadband data collection, I believe they call it. And so that is really showing more granular level data than we've ever had before. I would plug WI members, Ookla and WePlan Analytics both have data sets out there that are available, more on the commercial side, but they're our members. We love to support them. But I do think the federal government has really been trying to improve its technical capacity in this front and make sure that, going from a world where we were looking at census tract data and one served is all served, and kind of, from that really macro view, getting to the granular level has been a really big improvement, at least from what we're hearing from members, being able to see more clearly what to expect when they get there.
Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. The mapping portion of the government has come, miles and miles from what we had. They actually got out of the dial-up modem stage, I guess, specifically for broadband. And to that, a lot of the data that is out there, they already had. A lot of it was living in Esri or whatever file base that they use, typically is that. It was available to find. It was just a matter of downloading and putting it together. Yeah, there might be some nuances, but you had to do it. Specifically for the NTIA maps and the upcoming maps, it's a carrier verified map. I mean, that's the best thing about it is I remember working back at the state, everybody's worried about, you don't want to see my stuff. Well, we don't want to see your stuff. We just want to see what is or what isn't. And now we have a national map that everybody's gone through the arguments. We've, positive, negative, and this is what we have. And no, nothing's perfect, but it's a whole lot closer than we've ever been. And as far as the other side of the coin, where to go, the BLM, the land ownership, all of that, again, there are so many, including small counties out here, that have gone to a digital based map that's so easy to download, oftentimes for free. You just have to take the time to find it. And then you can oftentimes build your own maps and answer some of your own questions, which is unprecedented.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from John Rowe. He says that NATE, which is the National Association of Tower Erectors, maybe they go by NATE now only, has put together a document on safety in the right-of-way regarding broadband implementation. So appreciate you pointing out that resource, John. We have another question that I'd love to bring in here. Ron Suarez asks, would advocating for more unlicensed or shared spectrum help ensure that underserved communities have fair access to this critical resource? And just by way of introducing this topic, right? I think that we on this call know that wireless depends on wired, connections, right? You need to get fiber to towers to distribute signals out. But that said, could we maybe just get your perspective, Stephen, on what the differences between licensed, unlicensed, and alternative like fiber? What kinds of issues have to kind of cross the permitting threshold, if you will?
Right. Well, first, the first issue is the FCC doesn't have spectrum auction authority and hasn't now for almost 2 years. So I think that's the biggest question for our members right now, is when that's going to be reinstated, and so we can start seeing more spectrum getting out there. And I think, that's directly led to some of the secondary market transactions we've been seeing this year, because everyone doesn't expect new spectrum to be made available, at least in the short term. NTIA currently is undergoing their national spectrum strategy that identifies about 1,500 megahertz, maybe 2,400 megahertz. But that's only for study to see their availability. A big question is being able to wrangle some of this away from the federal government, particularly DoD. They are, obviously the default spectrum holder. So getting spectrum out there generally, I think is first and foremost, particularly for our members. And then you kind of get into the question of how it's licensed. Should it be fully unlicensed, licensed by rule, shared spectrum? I think there's a lot of interesting conversations going on around this space right now. We're still, I think, in the early stages of CBRS. It hasn't really played out in the way that a lot of people were hoping it would have. And so, I think there's definitely a good use for the CBRS spectrum on the commercial side. I think that will have a big part to play in, smart manufacturing. But that's kind of outside of the scope of this conversation. For getting, networks out there, I think first and foremost, it really has to be fully licensed, high power, wide access. That's what WIA advocates for. And, I think we can see this directly in the but really the explosion of fixed wireless in the last few years. Fixed wireless broadband has gone leaps and bounds from what it was a few years ago to, really dominating the last, I think, 5 or 6 quarters now. It's been the most subscribed, net adds overall. People seem really happy with it. I think it's going to play a big role in BEAD and getting rural connectivity, achieved, because it is faster to deploy than fiber. Again, nothing against fiber. We love fiber. And like Drew said, you don't get wireless without the wires underneath it. But to get that highly reliable connectivity, I think you do need, more licensed spectrum out there. Even if you had more unlicensed, kind of the question was about community access to it. You still need the infrastructure, the networks, all this. You can't just have a license for spectrum and turn your phone on and access it. It runs a network underneath it. It is part of the infrastructure itself. So being able to make sure you have that reliability, that high bandwidth throughput, huge for fixed connections. And, I think we kind of generally shifted to a focus on fixed home broadband connection during the pandemic for very important and obvious reasons. But if you want AI, machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, that stuff's all going to rely on mobile technology to really, unless you want to sit in your home, kind of hooked up to your VR kit, you're going to want that on the move. And so to get that kind of reliability, high bandwidth applications, you're going to need the fully licensed networks for that front.
Ryan, do you want to chime in on the question of technologies versus permitting?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much don't have much to follow up with
Okay.
what Steven said.
No problem. And John helpfully adds that NATE's official name is the Communications Infrastructure Contractors Association, nonprofit trade association. So I want to ask two final questions. One around state broadband offices and the steps they can take to support applications navigating federal permitting. And secondly, about legislative efforts. And we appreciate you, Stephen, mentioning the American Broadband Deployment Act, HR 3557, and talking through a little bit of that. But I would love your thoughts too, Ryan, on what's your legislative wish list, right? What are the ways to address problems at infrastructure deployment on federal lands, and what's the next steps of getting there? So let's hear from you on these two questions, Stephen, and then we'll hear from Ryan on these two questions.
Sure. Broadly, obviously permitting is near and dear to our hearts. Generally, when we talk about it, there's three things we want. We want it to be predictable, proportionate, and transparent. Kind of going back to what we were discussing about proportionality is huge when you're modifying a site, or even if you're, and laying fiber can be more disruptive, but there is even innovation in that space from micro trenching and, one-touch make ready, or rather dig once. So, there's really not a need for this whole, broader kind of onerous process that can take over a year. Our members joke it takes 2 years to put up a tower, about a week to actually construct the tower, and the other 108 weeks to get the permits approved. And so, getting ourselves out of the way is going to be huge for getting broadband built, getting communities connected. So I think American Broadband Deployment Act would do a lot of that. The FCC has made a lot of these reforms, but again, getting them codified at the federal level, I think would be a really big step in the right direction. And again, NTIA has really stepped up. I think we've seen a more consensus, and I think it's notable for a Democratic administration to recognize that these permitting and bureaucratic processes have become more of a burden than a benefit to the overall landscape. That used to kind of be more exclusively in the domain of Republicans. And so I think we'll see more deregulation in the upcoming administration. And so, legislatively, we just want to cut down the red tape. If the answer is no, let us know, and we'll work to fix it. But state broadband officers, I think, are starting to get this idea. They don't want to have a process that takes overly long. And so, making sure that you can track your applications, making sure that you can see where they are in the process, how to escalate them, things like that. And again, the state broadband officers, I think, have been doing a pretty admirable job on that front, along with NTIA. Sorry, just trying to think through the other things there, but
the state broadband offices, what specific things can they do to help?
We've seen kind of varying degrees, and it has been interesting in the BEAD process, but part of it is working with the state legislatures to make sure that the general infrastructure permitting process is more straightforward. Some states have been really on the front edge of that. Working with the state broadband or rather the NTIA broadband coordinators who have a few states under their jurisdiction, being able to kind of share best practices. I mean, going back even to the BLM NTIA training I referenced earlier, that I went to earlier this year, getting the folks in the room together, talking, sharing best practices and experiences, I think could be really impactful, and has a great benefit. So it is good to see, folks thinking about this, thinking hard on it, and how to get, the best solution kind of delivered to the people.
Great. What are your thoughts on these questions? State broadband offices and legislation, Ryan?
Yeah. So I guess I'm probably a little slighted to the state broadband office and how they can help. But I guess the one thing that I will always reiterate is don't be afraid to lean on them a little bit, because they have the contacts. I mean, we've had, like you said, some of the issues we had with some of the agencies, the federal agencies, and some federal permitting. It was one phone call for me, and the chief of staff took care of it, and we turned what had been a month-long issue into basically a few-week issue. And then it was completed and moved on. So don't be afraid to call out and just, keep that line of communication. Kind of goes back to the local level question we had earlier. Talk early, talk often. Don't be afraid to just call them up and have a coffee chat for just a few minutes. They appreciate that because they end up talking shop all day long to everybody they talk to. So even a 10-minute coffee chat is nice to have about whether the Cowboys played well or not this week. So then it kind of comes back to the point, and Stephen mentioned on this, is don't forget your NTIA reps. The NTIA reps are generally out here. I think there's two states per rep. Most of those, the one in Texas, the one in Idaho, most of those NTIA reps are similar to myself, and they were previously state broadband office directors. They just moved into the federal space. The one that I haven't heard mentioned is your RUS or USDA reps.
Right.
They have, they've been doing this for decades as well. So they may have some insights as well to play into. So really, again, talk early, talk often, and don't be afraid to call and just chat, even just for a few minutes.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Ryan, I wanted to make sure to hear just a bit more about the role you played in Wyoming. Your bio mentions that you served as the broadband director for the state of Wyoming, but you haven't really mentioned a lot about that. Could you maybe just speak a minute or two about what you did there, with maybe some specific reference to encountering and dealing with this permitting question?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the highlights of my career, actually. So I came in 2020, right as in fact, I was in DC before they shut DC down for the pandemic, and came home, and I think I brought it with me, but we won't go there. The the whole thing is it the CARES Act. So the kind of the crown jewel of mine is the CARES Act. We had the governor and the legislature, after much discussion, gave us $100 million to spend. Well, that was given to us, I believe, in July. Okay. By the time we put it out, got it done, turned around and put contracts out for building, that was September. Okay. So September 2020. When was the closing date for CARES before they extended? December 31, 2020. Well, the federal government extended it. My governor did not. So whatever we spent was what we spent, and we had to have it done by the end of the year. So September 15th, we agreed to deploy $56 million, up to $56 million. Well, through that, I had several that got most of their work done, but I had one that completed everything they were going to do. That included federal permits, it included local permits, it included right-of-way, it included a whole bunch of stuff and a whole lot of coordination that was way beyond me. But they got it done. They fully deployed a fiber to the home for $17 million. Greatest greatest accomplishment I've known in they were actually finishing trenches in the snow before midnight on 12/31. So how do you want to spend your New Year's Eve?
Wow.
So, but that's the tenacity. So as far as the permitting goes, I got involved with SHPO, got involved with BLM, got involved with Department of Defense. We have Department of Defense out in Wyoming. And the nuances to each. And there's no, and it goes back to what Stephen's really talked about is if I was to have a big wish list, I think one of the largest ones would be to coordinate and streamline. A permit's a permit for plowing in the ground. It shouldn't, DOD has their own thing, and I totally respect that. But the Forest Service and the BLM and, Park Service is a little different because they have a lot of historic, I get that. But realistically, it could be boiled down to at least 1 or 2 pots of soup instead of 20.
Yeah.
And I think we're working on that. It's really made a huge progress. I don't want anybody to think that I'm bashing on anybody there. It's not. It's just we're down to about 10 pots.
Yeah. Well, that will have to be our last word. We've covered a lot of ground. I appreciate Stephen Keegan being with us from the Wireless Infrastructure Association and Ryan Kundera from Finley. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon and next Thursday in Washington, D.C., Clyde's Gallery Place at 8:30 a.m. Sign up for broadband in the Trump administration. Take care, everyone. See you later.
Thank you, Drew. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.